There are people who are not born to be left alone. From the moment they learn to stand, the world begins asking them to bend. Not always with chains, not always with violence. Sometimes with smiles, with titles, with promises of safety. Sometimes with the quiet suggestion that silence is wisdom and obedience is maturity. And there comes a day when such a person must decide what kind of life is worth living. This is not a story about power. It is not a story about victory. It is not even a story about politics, though politics will circle it like a shadow. This is a story about posture, about the simple, dangerous act of standing upright when history expects you to lower your head. Before his name was spoken in foreign capitals, before his face appeared in newspapers, there was a man who understood something many never learn. He understood that freedom is not a gift handed down at ceremonies. It is a condition of the soul, and once a soul refuses to kneel, the body is rarely left in peace. Across Africa, across the black world, our elders know this truth well. They lived through decades when being too visible was a risk, when speaking too clearly could cost a job, a home, or a life. They learned when to whisper, and when silence kept food on the table. But they also remembered the few who refused to learn that lesson, the ones who spoke anyway, the ones whose names were meant to disappear. This story is about one of those names, not because he was flawless, not because he always chose wisely, but because, when the moment came that mattered most, he chose dignity over comfort. He chose truth over survival, and that choice echoed far beyond his lifetime. You will not hear this story told as it was once taught in distant classrooms, stripped of feeling and reduced to dates. You will hear it as it lives in memory, as something felt in the chest rather than memorized in the head, as something passed down, not to impress, but to remind. Because the day will always come when history speaks. The question is not whether it will speak, but who is allowed to do the speaking, and whether we are listening closely enough to recognize our own reflection in the voice. Listen carefully, not just for the name, but for the lesson beneath it, for the quiet warning and the steady courage of a man who understood that there are moments when standing upright becomes an act of inheritance. This is where that story begins. Kasai was not a place the world watched. It was a land of red soil and long memory, a place where people learned early that survival did not always come from abundance, but from endurance. Generations before any flag of independence was raised, the people of Kasai already understood what it meant to live under someone else's rules, on land that fed others before it fed its own children. Patrice Lumumba was born into that quiet weight of history. He came from the Batitela people, a community known not for wealth or power, but for a stubborn sense of self. They had learned, through hardship, that dignity was not something handed down by authority. It was something guarded, often silently, within families and communities. Children grew up watching adults who did not shout their pride, but carried it in how they stood, how they spoke, and how they refused to disappear. Lumumba did not grow up being told he was destined to lead. There were no grand prophecies whispered over his cradle. What he absorbed instead was subtler and far more lasting. He learned that a man could be poor without being small, that obedience demanded by force was not the same as respect earned by character, and that there was a difference between patience and surrender. Belgian rule pressed down on daily life in ways both visible and invisible. There were laws, uniforms, and imposed hierarchies, but there was also something more corrosive. The steady message that Congolese people were not meant to decide their own future. That message crept into schools, workplaces, and churches. It did not always announce itself loudly. Often, it arrived disguised as guidance. Young Lumumba watched this closely. He saw how some learned to lower their voices, how others learned to smile at their own exclusion. He noticed how ambition had to be carefully shaped so it did not threaten the order already in place. And somewhere in him, an early resistance took form, not loud, not reckless, but firm. Kasai taught him that land remembers, that the ground holds the footsteps of those who came before, even when their names are forgotten by official records. This understanding would stay with him. It shaped how he later spoke about Congo, not as a collection of tribes to be managed, but as a people bound together by shared loss and shared endurance. For many listening today, especially those who grew up navigating systems that asked them to be grateful for partial inclusion, this beginning feels familiar. The lesson is an old one. You can be surrounded by rules and still know they are not just. You can be taught manners that are really tools of control. And you can grow up understanding, long before you have the language for it, that something about the world is misaligned. Lumumba's childhood did not make him angry. It made him alert. From Kasai, he carried forward a simple but dangerous truth, that a people who remember who they are cannot be permanently managed. That truth would follow him far beyond his village, into classrooms, offices, and eventually onto the world stage. And once it followed him there, it would not let him rest. Education was supposed to be the path upward. For young Congolese men like Patrice Lumumba, schooling came wrapped in promises. Learn our language, adopt our manners, master our rules, and perhaps, one day, you will be allowed to step a little closer to the world that decides things. Lumumba took those promises seriously. He moved through missionary schools with discipline and hunger for knowledge. He read deeply, wrote carefully, and spoke with a clarity that unsettled his instructors. He did not ask questions to provoke. He asked because he needed answers that made sense. And often, the answers did not come. The classrooms taught him scripture, grammar, and obedience. But outside those walls, reality told a different story. No matter how well he spoke, no matter how neatly he dressed, there remained an invisible ceiling. He could approach it, even touch it, but never pass through. The colonial system had a name for men like him. They were called evolved, Africans who had adopted European ways. It sounded like progress. In truth, it was conditional acceptance. You were welcomed, as long as you remembered your place. Lumumba felt the contradiction sharply. He completed training at the government postal school with distinction and secured work as a postal clerk. It was a respectable position, a sign that the system approved of him. Yet approval did not bring equality. He still earned less. He was still watched more closely. He was still expected to be grateful. Then came the moment that stripped away illusion. Accused of financial wrongdoing, Lumumba was imprisoned. Whether the punishment fit the offense mattered less than what the experience revealed. In confinement, he learned how quickly the privileges of acceptance could vanish. The system that praised him yesterday could erase him tomorrow. Prison did not break him. It clarified him. He emerged with a sharper understanding. Education alone would not free a people who were not permitted to define themselves. Advancement without dignity was simply another form of control. And silence, no matter how well-mannered, would never earn true respect. From that point on, Lumumba's learning took a different shape. He read not just to succeed, but to understand power. He wrote not to impress, but to awaken. He spoke less like a student seeking approval, and more like a man discovering his own voice. Many who hear this part of the story recognize it immediately. The feeling of doing everything right and still being told it is not enough. The slow realization that assimilation does not guarantee safety. And the moment when one must decide whether to keep playing the game or step outside it entirely. Lumumba chose the second path. In doing so, he crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. From that moment forward, he was no longer preparing himself to fit into the existing order. He was preparing himself to challenge it. And once that decision was made, the quiet life he might have lived was already behind him. A voice does not become dangerous because it is loud. It becomes dangerous when it speaks for more than itself. By the late 1950s, Congo was restless. Beneath the surface of daily life, something was shifting. The old colonial structure still stood, but it no longer felt permanent. Across towns and villages, people were beginning to imagine a future that did not require permission. Patrice Lumumba sensed this before many others did. He understood that Congo's greatest weakness was not lack of resources or intelligence. It was fragmentation. The colonial system had been designed carefully to keep Congolese people separated by region, language, and tribe. As long as they spoke in many voices, none of them could be heard clearly. Lumumba refused that design. When he helped form a national movement that spoke to Congo as one people, he crossed into dangerous territory. This was not a regional organization. It did not belong to one ethnic group or one province. It claimed the entire country, and by doing so, it challenged the most reliable tool of control. For the first time, Lumumba was no longer speaking as an individual seeking reform. He was speaking as a mirror held up to the nation itself. That change carried a cost. He became visible in ways he never had before. His speeches traveled beyond the rooms where they were spoken. His words unsettled colonial administrators and frightened those Congolese leaders who had learned to survive by staying small. Unity, after all, threatens those who benefit from division. Lumumba did not soften his message to make it more acceptable. He spoke plainly about dignity, self-rule, and the right of Congolese people to decide their own destiny. He did not promise comfort. He promised responsibility, and that honesty drew both devotion and fear. Soon, the consequences followed. He was arrested, charged with inciting unrest, removed from public life for a time. The message was clear. Speaking for oneself might be tolerated. Speaking for everyone would not. Yet even confinement could not return him to obscurity. While imprisoned, Lumumba's name continued to spread. His absence made him larger, not smaller. People began to see in him something rare, a leader who did not ask them to trade one master for another, but asked them to stand as equals. This was the moment when Lumumba crossed a threshold that history does not forgive. From this point forward, he could no longer retreat into private life. The movement he helped awaken no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to the people who had begun to see themselves reflected in his courage. Many listening today recognize this turning point, the moment when speaking up stops being a personal risk and becomes a communal responsibility. When silence no longer feels neutral, but like betrayal. Lumumba did not claim to be ready for what followed. He simply understood that some doors, once opened, must be walked through. And once he did, the world began watching him very closely. Independence arrived, wearing ceremony. Flags were raised. Speeches were prepared. The world gathered to witness a transfer of power that looked orderly from a distance. On paper, Congo was free. A new government stood in place. Patrice Lumumba, once imprisoned and dismissed as dangerous, now held the title of Prime Minister. But freedom, as Lumumba already understood, does not arrive all at once. Behind the smiles and formal handshakes, the old structures remained. The army still answered to familiar voices. Foreign interests still circled the country's wealth, and many who applauded independence expected the new leaders to behave quietly, gratefully, and predictably. Lumumba did not. On the day meant to celebrate Congo's rebirth, the tone of history shifted. When others spoke in polished language about generosity and partnership, Lumumba spoke of suffering. He spoke of forced labor, humiliation, and stolen dignity, not to embarrass, but to tell the truth that independence without honesty was only theater. That moment changed everything. The room grew cold. Those who had hoped for a manageable leader heard something else entirely. They heard a man unwilling to play his assigned role. And in the world of power, refusal is remembered. From that day forward, Lumumba's position weakened rapidly. The army mutinied. Regions broke away. Foreign forces re-entered the country under the excuse of protection. Each crisis chipped away at the fragile authority of the new government. Lumumba turned to international institutions, asking them to honor the very principles they claimed to uphold. He asked not for favor, but for fairness. When those appeals were ignored, he reached elsewhere for support, believing Congo's sovereignty mattered more than appearances. That choice sealed his isolation. Suddenly, he was labeled reckless, dangerous, unfit to lead. Former allies distanced themselves. Rivals moved decisively. Power shifted behind closed doors, while Lumumba stood increasingly alone in the open. For many listening today, this part of the story cuts close to home. The realization that telling the truth can cost you allies, that institutions speak of justice but practice convenience, that leadership does not protect you when you refuse to bend. Lumumba felt that truth in real time. He was dismissed, confined, watched closely, his movements restricted, his voice reduced to whispers. Yet even then, he did not abandon his belief that Congo belonged to its people, not to fear or foreign calculation. This was the final test, not whether he could govern smoothly, but whether he would retreat into silence to preserve himself. He did not, and in choosing to stand firm while the ground disappeared beneath him, Patrice Lumumba stepped fully into the fate reserved for those who mistake independence for permission rather than responsibility. By the time Patrice Lumumba was removed from power, the path ahead had narrowed to almost nothing. He was no longer a prime minister in any meaningful sense. His authority had been stripped away, piece by piece, replaced by restrictions, watchful eyes, and constant reminders that his life was no longer his own. The house where he was kept became a cage without bars. Outside, soldiers stood guard. Inside, time slowed. Many would have accepted silence at that point. Silence would have meant survival. At least for a while. Silence would have meant retreating into private life, allowing history to move on without resistance. Lumumba understood this option clearly. He was not confused about the danger. He simply refused the trade. He attempted to escape confinement, not as an act of desperation, but as an act of continuity. He was trying to reach those who still believed Congo could belong to itself. He was trying to remain present in a struggle that others were eager to end without him. He did not get far. Captured again, Lumumba was moved from place to place, each transfer more ominous than the last. The process was deliberately quiet. No public trial. No open debate. The intention was not justice, but removal. a problem solved out of sight. In his final days, Lumumba understood something with brutal clarity. He understood that his life had become an inconvenience to powerful interests, that his survival represented unfinished business, and that the easiest way to restore order was to make him disappear. Yet even then, he did not renounce what he had said or believed. Those who encountered him during this period noted his composure, not calm born of hope, but calm born of acceptance. He had already crossed the line beyond which fear loses its power. When a person has decided that dignity matters more than time, threats become less effective. His execution was carried out far from the cameras, far from the capital, far from the people who had placed their faith in him. The act was meant to be final. No grave to visit, no body to mourn, just absence. But absence does not always erase. For many across Africa and the Black world, the news landed like a wound that did not close. A man who had spoken openly had been removed quietly. The lesson was unmistakable, but so was the consequence. Lumumba's death transformed him from a leader into a symbol that could not be negotiated with. This part of the story resonates deeply with those who have seen truth punished for being inconvenient, who have watched voices silenced not because they were wrong, but because they were clear. Lumumba's final stand was not dramatic in appearance. It was steady, consistent, human. He died without seeing the future he had imagined. But he did not die having betrayed it. And in that refusal, Patrice Lumumba entered a different kind of history, one not written by those who ordered his death, but carried quietly by those who remembered why he had lived. They tried to end Patrice Lumumba by removing his body. What followed instead was something they could not control. For a time, his name was spoken quietly. In some places, it was not spoken at all. Official histories moved on. New leaders appeared. New explanations were offered. But beneath those layers, memory did its quiet work. Across Africa and across the Black world, Lumumba became more than a man. He became a reference point, a reminder of what happens when someone refuses to confuse independence with permission. His story was not preserved in monuments at first, but in conversations, in questions whispered between generations, in the uneasy feeling that something important had been taken too early. For many elders, his name carried a familiar weight. They recognized the pattern: a leader who spoke plainly, a system that demanded silence, a removal framed as necessity. It was not unique to Congo. It echoed experiences lived in different forms, in different countries, under different flags. Lumumba's legacy survived because it answered a question that never stops being asked. What does it cost to stand upright? He did not leave behind a perfected nation. He did not solve every problem he named. What he left was something less visible, but more durable. He left an example of consistency, of refusing to change one's language to suit the comfort of power, of choosing to be remembered honestly, rather than tolerated quietly. That is why his story still finds listeners, especially among those who have lived long enough to understand compromise and its limits. People who know that survival sometimes requires silence, but that silence, practiced too long, can hollow out the soul. Lumumba speaks to that understanding. He reminds us that history is not only written by those who win, but carried by those who remember. That memory itself can be an act of resistance, and that telling a story truthfully, even decades later, restores something that was meant to be erased. Today, his name appears in books, lectures, and documentaries, but its real power remains elsewhere. It lives in the quiet recognition that his choice could have been different, that he could have lived longer by saying less, that he chose otherwise. For those listening now, his life invites reflection rather than instruction. It does not ask us to imitate his path. It asks us to examine our own, to consider where we have bent for safety and where we have stood firm without applause. Patrice Lumumba does not belong only to the past. He belongs to every moment when truth feels inconvenient and dignity feels costly. He belongs wherever people ask whether history will remember them as comfortable or as consistent. And as long as that question is asked, his story will continue to be told, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, the way all lasting truths survive. There comes a moment, long after the noise fades, when a story settles into its true place, not as a headline, not as an argument, but as a memory that refuses to disappear. Patrice Lumumba's life was short, but its meaning was never meant to be measured in years. It was meant to be measured in posture, in the way a person chooses to stand when standing comes at a cost, in the way a voice sounds when it refuses to ask permission to exist. He did not live to see a peaceful Congo. He did not live to enjoy the comfort of age or the safety of distance. What he lived long enough to do was make a choice, again and again. When silence would have been easier, he chose to speak. When retreat would have been safer, he chose to remain present. When compromise would have extended his life, he chose consistency. That is why his story still reaches us. For those who have lived through decades of shifting promises, broken assurances, and carefully managed expectations, Lumumba feels familiar. He reminds us of people we have known, people who told the truth too plainly, people who paid for that honesty, not because they were wrong, but because they were clear. This is why his name continues to surface in conversations about African history, not as a lesson to memorize, but as a mirror to look into. His life asks questions rather than offering instructions. It asks what we are willing to trade for comfort. It asks how much silence costs over time. It asks whether survival alone is enough. For many, these are not abstract questions. They are lived realities, choices made quietly at kitchen tables, decisions shaped by responsibility to family, to community, to the next generation watching closely. Lumumba does not judge those choices. He simply stands as a reminder that another path exists, and that it has always existed. In that sense, his story belongs alongside the great history legends, not because he conquered empires, but because he refused to let his spirit be managed. It belongs among the stories people return to late at night, the kind of history for sleep that does not numb the mind, but steadies it, the kind that reminds us we are not alone in our questions. What remains most powerful about Lumumba is not the manner of his death, but the clarity of his life. He showed that truth spoken plainly carries weight long after the speaker is gone, that memory, passed carefully from one generation to the next, can outlast force, that even when historical facts are distorted or buried, something essential still survives in the telling. And for those who carry the long memory of Black history, his story offers neither comfort nor despair. It offers grounding. It says that dignity has always had defenders, even when the cost was unbearable. It says that standing upright is never wasted, even when the outcome feels unfinished. As long as people continue to ask how they should live with integrity in an unequal world, Patrice Lumumba will remain present, not as a ghost, but as a steady question carried forward. And perhaps that is the truest form of independence any story can achieve.